Good morning, everybody. I'm Stefanie. Here are my social handles in the spirit of real-time interaction. And I'm not actually really going to talk about millennial money today. If you do want to read about millennial money, feel free to take a look at my website. The book is here. Just Google me. You'll see more millennial money information than you could ever imagine consuming. But I want to talk about myself, which is a very millennial thing to do, right? Right. So I want to tell you a little bit about my story and why that matters and what it means in engaging millennials. So I'm going to start out with a really random question. Are any of you familiar with the children's storybook character Fancy Nancy? I see some hands, right? So if you have children, you know that to little girls everywhere, Fancy Nancy is kind of a big deal. And if you don't know, let me fill you in. Fancy Nancy loves all things fancy. But in particular, Fancy Nancy loves fancy words, like exquisite instead of nice, and fuchsia instead of pink. Now for me, Fancy Nancy was my job. At the age of 25, armed with a very expensive college degree, I decided to pursue my passion of being a professional actress, playing the role of Fancy Nancy on stages all across America. How millennial of me, right? Well, in addition to this job, I had another job of sorts during that time. And that was figuring out a way to live on the $54 a day I was supplied by my employer for food and housing. $54, 3 meals, and hotel. Naturally, I became a money-saving ninja. Not only did I rebook most of the company-provided itinerary to more cost-conscious alternatives on behalf of our entire cast of 6, I also went totally rogue and started finding ways to reduce my expenses to zero. Now, we were traveling every day, occasionally every other day, from our home base of New York City, as far west as Los Angeles, as far north as Michigan, as far south as Texas, over the course of about 6 months. And so about a month into it, I realized we were scheduled to stay at a hotel that was about 30 minutes away from my parents' home in Connecticut. So I suggested to my fellow castmates, well, maybe we don't stay at the Super 8 for 12 hours and pay more money than we get paid. And we stay with my parents. And my parents happily hosted us, and we happily stayed with my parents, and I happily saved my $54 that day. Well, after that, I was always on the lookout for new connections. It didn't matter how distant. A half-cousin by marriage I had met once 14 years earlier hosted me not far from here in Davis, California. My babysitter from when I was in pre-K, who now lives on the outskirts of Seattle, let me stay with her. And a friend of mine who I hadn't seen in years, while passing through Chicago, let me stay there, and she gave me about 4 days' worth of food in Tupperware when I left. So my network served me pretty well, but it was only so vast. And about 4 months into touring, the idea of paying more money to bunk up with my roommate at a Days Inn really just was not sounding so hot. So, like the millennial I am, I turned to the internet for another solution. And within a matter of an hour, I was messaging complete strangers, asking if I could spend the evening on their couch. Now, that might sound crazy to some of you. To others of you, maybe a couple here and there, maybe it sounds familiar. Maybe it's something you've even done yourself. Well, I had confirmed my first stay within a matter of a couple of hours using the site couchsurfing.org, which is an online travel community that connects people who have a couch or a spare room or a spare bed with people passing through who need a place to stay. And I spent the night in Provo, Utah, and I've since traveled courtesy of the Couchsurfing Network in Salt Lake City, in Boston, Massachusetts, in New Orleans, Louisiana, and various other cities across America. Now, I am from New York City, which means I'm not entirely naive. I am very aware that I am a small, young woman traveling alone in unknown places. But never once in my various stays with strangers did I ever feel unsafe. And never once did I feel compromised. But perhaps most surprisingly about my experience, which was back in early 2012, is that today it's become almost commonplace. In fact, my mother, who understandably balked at the idea of my staying in the homes of strangers when I first told her about it over the phone, just last summer booked her first stay in Paris using Airbnb. And if any of you aren't familiar with Airbnb, it's very similar, a travel community that connects people who have an extra room or bed or couch with those who are traveling through and want to rent it out. Now, for those of you who are still skeptical of how normal all of this is, consider this. Since launching in 2008, Airbnb has become one of the most valuable hospitality brands in the world. So what does this surging popularity of staying in the homes of strangers really have to do with anything? Well, quite a bit, it turns out. It tells us that we're moving towards a collaborative, peer-driven economy, or as it's more popularly known, the sharing economy. And it's not just Airbnb that's giving Marriott a run for their money. It's Uber and Lyft that are putting taxis out of business. And it's peer-to-peer lending platforms that are giving banks some major competition. And millennials, like me, are at the forefront of that shift. And it's not just us, because we're taking our parents and our peers and the future along with us. Now, I want to backtrack a little bit here to 2012 and Fancy Nancy and my money-saving mission. Over the course of those months that I had learned to live on nearly nothing, I also became very obsessed with my personal finances. I would track every penny I spent and every penny I earned on spreadsheets. Not only that, I became obsessed with personal finance literature. I read all the books I could, I read all the blogs I could, and by the end of my 6-month stint as Fancy Nancy, not only did I have a very fancy vocabulary, I was also a total money geek. And so, I figured I'd take to the internet to share some of my newfound enthusiasm for personal finance with my peers, who were millennials, like me, struggling to live on next to nothing. Little did I know that a few years later, I would be a published personal finance author, a content strategist and brand partner for Fortune 500 financial services companies, and a nationally regarded millennial money expert who appears on the news from Fox News to Bloomberg Business, all with my degree in drama and years of experience singing and dancing around the stages of America. So, why, right? Why does this work? The same thing that makes my millennial money advice regarded as national expertise is the same thing that makes a stranger's home or a stranger's car work as a hotel room or a taxi cab. And that's the special something that it really takes to connect in this new peer-driven collaborative economy. And that's the special something that it really takes to connect with millennials. And that special something is trust. So you might be thinking, well, trust has always been central to the ability to make meaningful connections and operate successfully in business. And while that's true, the way in which we now measure trust and build trust is undergone a major transformation in the past 10 years or so that's coincided with millennials entering into adulthood. So if you're an organization or a business trying to engage this new millennial audience and all the audiences that they influence, you need to build trust in this new way, this peer-driven way that's meaningful to that audience. So in my case, for example, there are a lot of people who do what I do. They write and they speak about money, many of whom have advanced degrees and very fancy letters after their name that mean things. I have none of that. But many of those people fail to build a following around their message. And many of those people fail to emerge as industry experts. And that's in part because those institutional measures of trust, those degrees and certifications, etc., are not enough to connect in a collaborative economy that's driven by peer trust. Institutional trust was not designed for the collaborative age. And for millennials who feel disillusioned by institutions, by having come of age during the financial crisis, by suffering in a post-recession job market, burdened by crippling student loan debt, the structure of institutional trust is broken. So millennials are at the forefront of this shift from institutional trust to peer trust. And in order to succeed with this new audience and those who follow, that peer trust needs to be cultivated. Now, we've heard a lot of really wonderful tactical ways of how to go about implementing that peer trust. Everything Chelsea was talking about, that is what you need to do to build peer trust. And I also have a couple of examples I'm going to talk about here. The first one is community. Utilize communities, build communities. You'll notice that a lot of these successful collaborative business models I've been talking about aren't just businesses, they are communities. And that's because communities are driven by peer trust. And these marketplaces like Etsy, like Airbnb, they have peer rating systems as part of the platform. So that every time I am using the platform, whether I'm the service provider or the consumer, I'm being rated. And so if I'm coming to the platform and I'm trusting this community, and the community in turn trusts you, I in turn can come to trust you too, even if we've never met one another. And that can translate into a face-to-face interaction and a business transaction. So community can be really powerful in cultivating this kind of peer-to-peer trust. The other thing you can do is provide access. The other common denominator of all these successful businesses is technology. And because technology provides access. And for millennials, access is key. Access is a given. We are digital natives. Access over ownership is the big millennial mantra. So why is that so important? Because it takes those information and resources and it democratizes them. Which brings us back to this importance of community. It's not a top-down structure in which we're filtering down and only a select few get access. We're turning that model on its head. We want access down here, and for this user content to inform the rest of the bottom-up experience. So provide access, and when you do, you open the doors to a greater audience for yourself to demonstrate your value and then engage that person in a consumer relationship. The third thing to do is personalization, and this is really important to me because this is really where my whole business model lies. So again, we're talking about the user-generated content like we were talking about before. This is the kind of content that we engage with. We do not want to hear from the top of the big bank that we feel has failed us and be preached at. What we want is to hear from somebody like me with a personal story that is familiar, who's bringing me into a community and giving me access to information and resources I need. And even if that resource winds up being the big bank in the end, the vehicle of this personal connection makes all the difference. Because we live in an internet age, and any of you can look up anything in a matter of seconds, and you can get access to good information. Information isn't proprietary in the internet age. Personal experiences are, and they always will be. So that's the meaningful differentiator. So open up and be personal and share the vulnerabilities and the challenges like living on $54 a day and deciding to save money by sleeping in the homes of strangers, because that's compelling and that's meaningful and that builds the peer trust that's necessary to form a relationship that then can transform into a business transaction. So we think of millennials as these hyper-connected, technologically driven digital natives, and all that's true. That said, we're using technology to bring us back to these old school values, and that is community and accessibility and personalization. And you don't have to look any further than Facebook to see that in action. And the fact is, those values hold true across the millennial experience, including the consumer experience. We are moving further and further away from empty institutional transactions and increasingly toward personal relationships, personalized consumer relationships built on peer-to-peer driven trust. So, to engage with a millennial audience and all of the audiences they influence, because they do, look at my mom staying in Airbnb, parents to peers, peer trust is where you need to begin. Thank you.